So it's been a while since my last upload. I gave Shotgun Knight a New Game Plus update way back in January, and I just finished my semester for college. It took up a lot of my time learning about heaps, trees, CPU architecture, and Dijkstra's algorithm. And now all of my college classes are done, so I can come back to Unity and get back into making games with a game jam. A game jam is an event where a bunch of people of all experience levels come together to make games in a tight time frame, and usually have some sort of theme. The jam I joined was hosted by Game Dev TV, and the theme was Last Stand. The jam was about 10 days, which is not a lot of time to make a game, so I got right to brainstorming. So early on I decided that I wanted the main mechanic to be getting stronger as your health gets lower. I eventually settled on making an arena-style melee combat game, where you fight enemies while they chip down your health, making you stronger in the process. So I started by making a simple player controller, and by making, I mean yoinking it straight out of Shotgun Knight and modifying it just a little bit to fit a top-down game. Then I set up attacking animations with a sword, so you could attack wherever you pointed the mouse. This is Bob. He currently can't do anything other than stand there with his hammer. Bob can't fight back against the player, so we need to give Bob some sort of AI so he can fight with the player. First, Bob needs a way to move towards the player, also known as pathfinding. There's a couple of different ways to go about this. The first and simplest solution is to have the enemy make a straight beeline for the player, but this leads to Bob just walking into walls. A common pathfinding solution involves using a nav mesh, which defines all of the walkable space for Bob. Then a pathfinding algorithm like A-star or Dijkstra's is used to find the shortest path to a desired destination. And then there's the method that I want to implement called context-driven steering, which I found out about on YouTube from Sunny Valley Studio. He has a helpful guide on how to set up this sort of system. I'll link his video in the description. What context-driven steering does is that it takes in its surroundings and it calculates the desirability for each direction. The length of green lines represent how desirable the direction is, and the red lines represent how undesirable a direction is. It then takes all of this information and calculates the dot product of all of these vectors to get a final direction that the AI is going to move in. So for example, if Bob is behind the wall and the player's behind that wall, it'll be more desirable to move diagonal or around the wall as opposed to straight into it, so Bob will navigate around the wall. This gives a more organic feeling to the enemies because they can detect their surroundings and react to the environment without the need of a nav mesh. So first we start with the detectors, which will check which obstacles are in a certain radius of the enemy, so it can only see close by objects. This also allows for a line of sight check, so it shoots a raycast towards the player, and if it's intersected with any detected obstacles, Bob cannot see the player. Next, we create the steering behaviors, which calculate the green and red lines for desirability, which go out in 8 directions around the enemy. This is stored as an array of 8 floats, indicating how strong the detection is for targets and obstacles. Then, there's the context solver, which takes in all of these calculated values and calculates a final direction for the AI to move towards. And there's one additional feature that helps put this all together, which is caching the last seen position of the player. If the player moves out of Bob's line of sight behind the wall, Bob will navigate towards the position where the player was last seen, giving Bob the ability to chase the player even if the player is not visible. Next, we give Bob the ability to attack the player so he can finally fight back. Bob checks if he's a certain distance from the player and swings his hammer. I also added a knockback effect to both the player and Bob as a visual indicator of hits connecting. So with all of this, we now have a working enemy that we can fight against. Since we are fighting these enemies in an arena, I needed a system to spawn in enemies, so I made a script that would spawn Bob once, just to test it out. This is where I started to run into issues. When Bob was instantiated to the scene, he didn't move. The enemy that was already in the scene worked properly, but the instantiated one didn't. Also, toggling Bob between disabled and enabled broke the pathfinding. I spent about 2 days debugging, printing out values, and Googling trying to figure out what the issue was with the pathfinding, and why it only worked for the enemy that was already in the scene before playing. This issue was really weird because just toggling the enemy to disabled and back to enabled broke everything. At this point, there was only 2 days left in the jam and I didn't have a working project, so my only option was to scrap all of this pathfinding stuff and build a completely different game in 48 hours. I started by switching from melee combat to a top-down shooter, and the weapon of choice, a shotgun. A knight wielding a shotgun, very original. I definitely haven't made a whole game about a knight with a shotgun already. The new objective I came up with is defending a fortress from approaching orcs. I mapped out a simple fortress to defend and I reprogrammed Bob's AI just to walk towards the wall. Then I made bullets so we could shoot Bob, so he can't attack our walls. Bob is looking a little lonely out there, so let's give him a friend. Billy is like Bob, but he can reach you faster, but has less health. Bob is slower with more health and deals more damage. And I made one more enemy, which is Evil Billy. He's very weak, but extremely fast, and deals a lot of damage, even more than Bob. Now that we have a couple of enemies, it's time to make them advance towards our fortress. I made an enemy spawner, which picked a random enemy and then spawned it at a random height. Then it picked a random cooldown for the next enemy, between bounds that I set. I needed the game to ramp up in difficulty as the game progressed, so my solution to this was to decrease the upper and lower bound for spawn time, gradually until it reaches a very small spawn cooldown. I also wanted to preserve that original idea I had of getting stronger as your health gets lower, so I made turrets, which you'd acquire as you get closer to losing. These would fire automatically every couple of seconds, and I had a few different types of turrets. Shotguns would be at the corners of the fortress. Assault rifles would pivot up and down and spray bullets at the enemies. And the final, strongest turret was a laser gun, which would shoot a burst of lasers, pivot up and down, and pierce through enemies. To make sure the player couldn't just sit there and wait for these turrets to spawn in by losing health, I also added a kill count requirement alongside the loss of health to unlock new turrets, so you'd actively have to try to shoot as many enemies as possible to unlock stronger turrets. And with all of that together, we sort of have a working game, with enemies, progression, and an inevitable death that you cannot escape. So yeah, I submitted this game with a few hours left and ranked 284 out of 1,116 submissions. Overall, I'm pretty happy with how this game turned out for only 48 hours, and I definitely want to revisit context-driven steering and implement it properly to make a melee combat game out of it. Smash like if you like, smash dislike if you don't, subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.